Hi, I'm Dr. Ben Newman. It's my job to study and grow coronaviruses. Based on the scientific literature, I'm going to try and answer your questions. And so, this is going to be a two-parter, probably two separate videos, but both for Holly. But there's two good questions in there, and yeah, each one's like a paragraph, and we got to do justice to both of these, I think. So, two short videos. So video number one. Here we go. First of all, good morning, Holly, and thanks for these good questions. All right, so one, we listened to the response on questions about aerosols and if we are doing enough to protect ourselves. Yeah, which generally the answer is no, and I would say a good way to spot check that is that the precautions that we should be taking to protect ourselves from aerosols of COVID 19, which is SARS coronavirus 2, should also protect us against like the flu and strep throat and most common cold viruses. And so if you're getting any one of those, and yeah, we've had bouts of some of these things in the family, it means there are cracks in your defense. Basically, there are things that could be improved, and if something else got in, then it could have been COVID. And if it wasn't, I'm glad. I'm very glad. Let's see. Then my husband asked, okay, well, what about our eyes? Good question. Yeah. Can they be a point of entry and infection for aerosolized virus? Yeah, the answer is there was a paper published a long time ago, I'm thinking March, that suggested that there was a little bit of the two proteins in the cornea of the eye, so that outer surface, and so these would be the one is called ACE2. That's the one the virus is actually going to grab onto. And the other is called TMPRSS2. It actually sort of reaches around and clips the virus in such a way that it can now proceed and actually merge with the cell. And so you need both of those factors at the same time in the same place. And the more of those two factors, the better. If I remember right, there weren't particularly outstandingly high amounts of this. And uh, yeah, but it's a decent technique where they pull out individual cells and look at what each cell is making. And so they found a bunch of cells in the cornea that seem to be making the right proteins. And so theoretically, it should be possible. If the virus did get into the cornea, the question is where would it go? And that is a question that's not super easily answerable. There weren't any other tissues within the eye itself that seem to have both the receptors, and so it's probably not going to spread within the eye. You're not going to get COVID-induced blindness, at least by a direct route. It would have to go all the way around and get into the brain, and hit it from the backside probably. And I haven't seen any evidence for that. But potentially, if you did get it into the cornea, then the tear ducts would drain down into the nose, and at the back of the nose, we know there are some cells that can be infected, and so these are the ones that are also involved in smell. And so, loss of smell, the best explanation we have is that this is just a symptom of infection and probably destruction of those cells that are involved in smell. Yeah, up in the nose. So, yeah, what about our eyes? Anecdotally, I haven't heard of any cases from the US or Europe, but in talking with some doctors who were treating patients over in China a little bit earlier on, they said they had seen two cases where a person first showed up presenting with conjunctivitis, essentially. So, like pink eye, basically, which would be caused by any number of viruses or occasionally bacteria, but uh, if they're good, they can tell the difference between those two more often than not. Yeah. Um, and so they started as this, and then later these people tested positive for COVID 19 or SARS coronavirus 2 down in the lungs. So it is at least possible. The receptors exist, the pathway exists. It doesn't seem to be a major route of infection, at least as far as we can verify. It seems to be much more likely that the virus goes right in the nose or the mouth, and that's what starts it. But yeah, I would say keep an eye on the eyes because, yeah, it is possible. It's just not the most likely way that it could happen. And then the last part of this question, which is still, remember, just the first half of this giant question, is are wait staff in restaurants particularly vulnerable? The answer is yes, very much so. Yeah. in any one interaction, there's not necessarily a whole lot of vulnerability if they are wearing a mask and or a face shield. But the thing with working in a restaurant is you are there for 6 hours, 8 hours, something like that. You're probably even taking your break, during which you may have a little snack because, yeah, you need a drink of water to, keep on your feet or something. Yeah, during that time. And so, yeah, the virus laden droplets could potentially build up in the room. And it's just a higher amount of exposure to a greater number of people than you would get in most other situations. And so that would be likely to have some sort of effects that increase the risk of wait staff catching COVID-19. And these are things that are difficult to track. So if there was only one giant restaurant company, like if we only had McDonald's in the United States, then McDonald's would probably be keeping stats, and from that company's stats, we could figure out roughly what is the risk of working a counter or being wait staff. In my McDonald's, they come out with a little, napkin over the arm and serve your Big Macs like that. Um, uh, yeah, but since it's broken up in all these little tiny ones, that data doesn't always get pushed through to the national database because your average person may be a member at a gym, they may be working as a waitress, they may be going to school also, and they may have a kid in daycare that they have to pick up, and they may, there's a lot of risk factors, and it is difficult to unpick these without really good, clean data sets. And yeah, for the most part, those good, clean data sets are not being captured, at least right now in the U.S. They may be in other places, but yeah, not here. So yeah, it makes sense. It makes good logical sense that waitstaff would be especially vulnerable to getting infected. Um, but waitstaff being potentially kind of like part time and maybe even sort of piecework, like you work an hour, you get paid for an hour, and you don't show up, you don't get paid kind of people. There may be extra pressure on them to basically walk it off and work through a minor illness that could be COVID. And so, again, there are reasons like that why you may have underreported cases in that sector. So it's hard to verify with data, but logically, it definitely makes sense. If that's any comfort or useful answer to you. So that's the end of the first question. Thanks very much. This has been Ask Dr. Ben.